The rope was already hanging from the wooden beam when Alira Vance was pulled through the crowd, her wrists bound so tight that her fingers had gone white. The square in Ashford Hollow had never been this full. Every window along the street held a face, every rooftop held a shadow, and every mouth in the crowd whispered the same word: killer, 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 as if saying it enough times would make it feel true. She did not cry. She had promised herself the night before that she would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. Her chin stayed lifted, even as the guards shoved her up the wooden steps of the platform, even as the executioner tested the rope with a firm tug, even as the magistrate stood at the front of the crowd, with a smile he did not bother to hide. Magistrate Alden Whitmore had wanted this day for 2 weeks, from the moment Alira had been dragged from her small cottage on the edge of town, accused of murdering the wealthy merchant Garrick Vane. He had pushed for the fastest trial the law would allow. Witnesses had been found within hours. A bloodied knife had been found within her chest, tucked beneath a floorboard she swore she had never touched. The whole town had accepted the story because it was easy, and because nobody in Ashford Hollow dared question a magistrate who controlled every purse string and every favor in the region. But on that morning, as Alira stood at the edge of the platform with the noose only a few steps away, a sound rose from the back of the crowd that made even the magistrate's smile falter. The low rumble of hooves, the sharp jingle of a carriage's iron fittings. And then, parting the crowd like a blade through water, came a procession that had no business being in a town this small. The Duke had come. Nobody in Ashford Hollow had seen Duke Roderick Ashvane in person before that day. He was a name spoken in taxes and decrees, a signature at the bottom of laws, a shadow that ruled from a castle 3 days' ride away. And yet here he was, dressed in deep blue with silver stitching, stepping down from his carriage with the calm of a man who had never once needed to explain himself. The crowd fell into a hush so complete that Alira could hear her own heartbeat pounding against her ribs. She did not understand why a duke would travel 3 days to watch a seamstress hang. She did not know that the answer to that question would soon unravel everything the town believed to be true. Roderick walked through the parting crowd without a single glance to either side. His eyes were fixed on the platform, on the woman standing there, with her hands bound and her head held high, despite everything stacked against her. He had read the trial report twice on his journey, and twice he had found it wanting. A merchant dead in his own study. A knife hidden in a floorboard that had, according to the carpenter who built the cottage, been nailed shut for 11 years before the murder. A magistrate who moved with unusual haste to close the case. None of it sat right in the Duke's mind, and men who ignored things that did not sit right in their minds rarely kept their titles for long. He reached the front of the crowd and raised a single-gloved hand. The executioner, halfway through tightening the rope, froze in place. "Hold this execution," Roderick said, his voice carrying easily across the silent square. "I wish to observe the proceedings before they are finished." Magistrate Whitmore stepped forward with the practiced smile of a man used to charming his way past inconvenient questions. "Your Grace, this is a matter already settled by the court. The woman was found guilty 3 days ago. The evidence was clear." "Then the evidence will survive a few more minutes of daylight," Roderick answered. "I have traveled a long way, Magistrate. I would like to understand what I am watching before it happens." There was nothing the magistrate could say to that, without appearing to hide something, and so he bowed stiffly and gestured for the guards to step back from the rope. Alira, still standing at the edge of the platform, felt something she had not felt in 2 weeks, a flicker of hope, thin as a candle flame in wind, but a flicker nonetheless. She did not know who this Duke was to her, or why he had come, but she understood one simple truth. A man who traveled 3 days to ask questions was not a man who believed the easy story. Roderick climbed the steps of the platform himself, ignoring the murmurs that rippled through the crowd at such an unusual act. He stood a few feet from Alira and studied her face carefully, the way a man studies a ledger, looking for a mistake in the numbers. She did not look away from him. She had nothing left to lose by meeting his gaze directly. "You are the seamstress," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am," she answered. Her voice was steady, though her heart was not. "And you are accused of murdering Garrick Vane." "I am accused of it. I did not do it." A ripple of laughter came from somewhere in the crowd, quickly silenced by the guards. Everyone convicted claimed innocence after all, but Roderick did not laugh. and he did not smile. He simply nodded once, slowly, as if filing her words away for later use. "I have questions for the magistrate," he said, turning away from her at last. "And I suspect the answers will determine whether this rope is used today or not at all." The crowd erupted into whispers the moment the words left his mouth, and Alira, standing on the platform with her life balanced on a thread thinner than the rope beside her, allowed herself, just for a moment, to breathe. What none of them knew, not the crowd, not the magistrate, not even Alira herself, was that the true story behind Garrick Vane's death had already begun to unravel 3 weeks earlier, in a room far from Ashford Hollow, where a young man named Edwin Whitmore had made a mistake he believed no one would ever trace back to him. Edwin was the magistrate's nephew, a young man with expensive tastes and a gambling habit that had drained every coin his family had ever given him. He had spent the better part of a year borrowing from men who did not accept late payments kindly, and Garrick Vane, a merchant known throughout the region for lending money at cruel rates, had been his final and most dangerous creditor. On the night Garrick died, Edwin had gone to his study not to negotiate, but to beg for time. The argument had grown loud enough that a servant passing in the hallway had heard raised voices, though she had not stayed to listen further, fearing punishment for eavesdropping on her employer's affairs. By the time she returned an hour later to check on the fire in the study, Garrick Vane was dead, and Edwin was long gone, his boots leaving faint prints in the mud outside the merchant's garden gate. Edwin had panicked that night in ways that would haunt him for weeks. He had gone straight to his uncle, not for comfort, but because he knew that a Whitmore accused of murder would destroy the family's standing in every court in the region. And Alden Whitmore, faced with the choice between protecting the family name and pursuing true justice, had chosen his family without a moment's hesitation. It had not taken him long to find someone to blame instead. Alira Vance was known to have visited Garrick's home only days before his death, delivering a repaired coat that the merchant had commissioned. She had no family of influence to defend her, no coin to hire a skilled advocate, and no friends among the town's powerful families. She was, in every practical sense, the perfect person to accuse. The knife had been planted with the help of a servant loyal to the Whitmore family, a quiet man named Silas Crane who did whatever he was asked without questioning the reasons behind it. The false testimony had been arranged through promises of coin and threats of eviction for tenants who lived on Whitmore land. Within a week, the entire town believed a story that had been built as carefully and deliberately as a house of cards, and just as fragile. Standing on the platform now, with the Duke's unexpected arrival threatening to topple everything he had built, Magistrate Whitmore felt the first true stirrings of fear he had experienced since the night his nephew came to him covered in mud and panic. He forced his expression into something calm, something confident, even as his mind raced to find a way to steer the Duke's questions away from the truth. "Your Grace," he said, keeping his voice even, "I assure you the trial was conducted fairly. Witnesses testified under oath. The evidence was examined by the court's own inspector." "Then you will not mind if I examine it again myself," Roderick replied, "with my own eyes and my own questions." The magistrate had no way to refuse without appearing guilty, and so he nodded stiffly, silently cursing the day this particular duke had chosen to take an interest in a town so far from his own castle. He did not yet know that Roderick's interest had nothing to do with mercy for a condemned seamstress, and everything to do with a merchant's secret dealings that had, for months, been quietly undermining the Duke's own trade routes through the region. Garrick Vane, it turned out, had not simply been a wealthy merchant. He had been moving goods through hidden routes to avoid the taxes owed to the Duke's treasury, working alongside partners whose names Roderick had been trying to uncover for the better part of a year. His death, so sudden and so conveniently explained by the local court, had struck Roderick as far too tidy an ending to a story that had been anything but simple. He had come to Ashford Hollow not out of concern for one woman's fate, but because he suspected that whoever killed Garrick Vane held answers to questions that mattered far more to his own interests. It was only now, standing before Alira on the platform, watching the calm and unwavering conviction in her eyes, that something else had begun to take root in his mind. A suspicion that the woman about to hang for this crime might be as innocent as she claimed, and that the truth being hidden from him ran deeper than mere trade and taxes. "Clear the platform," he said finally, turning to address the guards. "The execution is postponed until I have spoken with every witness who testified in this case." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, some in approval, some in confusion, a few in open frustration at being denied the spectacle they had gathered to witness. Magistrate Whitmore's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, knowing that any protest now would only draw more suspicion toward himself. Elira was led from the platform not to freedom, but to a small holding room near the town hall, her execution merely delayed rather than cancelled. Yet even a delay felt like a miracle after 2 weeks of believing her life would end that very morning. As the guards closed the door behind her, she allowed herself to sit for the first time in hours, her legs finally giving way beneath the weight of everything she had carried alone. She did not know the Duke's true reasons for stopping her execution. She did not know about Edwin's gambling debts, or Silas Crane's planted knife, or the secret trade routes that had drawn Roderick's attention to this town in the first place. All she knew was that for the first time since her arrest, someone with real power had looked at her and asked a question instead of simply accepting a lie. Outside, in the square, Roderick stood before the crowd with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the magistrate's carefully composed face for any crack that might reveal the truth hiding beneath it. He did not yet know how deep the deception ran, or how close to his own court the true killer stood, but he intended to find out, no matter how long it took, and no matter whose family name it destroyed along the way. As the sun climbed higher over Ashford Hollow, the town settled into a strange and uneasy quiet, every resident aware that something larger than one woman's fate had just begun to unfold before them, though none of them yet understood exactly what it was. The holding room smelled of old wood and dust, and through its single small window, Elira could see a narrow slice of sky, gray and heavy with the promise of rain. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall and tried to steady her breathing, though her mind kept circling back to the moment the Duke had raised his hand and stopped everything. She thought of Cassian. He was a soldier stationed at the garrison 2 miles outside Ashford Hollow, and for the better part of a year, they had shared something quiet and careful. Meetings arranged in the evenings when his duties allowed. Letters passed through a trusted friend when they could not see each other in person. Their bond had never been announced publicly, partly because soldiers were forbidden from forming attachments with townsfolk without their captain's approval, and partly because Elira had always feared that anything good in her life would eventually be taken from her. She wondered if he knew what had happened to her. She wondered if he had heard about her arrest, her trial, her sentence, and whether he had tried to reach her at all. The guards had refused every request she made to send word to him, citing orders from the magistrate himself, and in the silence of the following days, she had begun to fear the worst, that perhaps Cassian had been warned away from her case entirely, or worse, that he had been told lies about her guilt convincing enough to keep him from coming. What she did not know was that Cassian had spent every single day since her arrest trying desperately to find a way to help her. He had gone to his captain first, requesting leave to investigate the circumstances of the murder, only to be denied outright with a warning that interfering in a magistrate's case was not the business of a common soldier. He had gone to the town records office next, searching for any information about Garrick Vane's dealings that might explain who truly had reason to want him dead. But the clerk there, a nervous man named Peregrine Dale, had refused to hand over any documents without written permission from the magistrate himself, permission that would obviously never be granted. Frustrated and increasingly desperate, Cassian had turned to the only other avenue left to him. He began watching the Whitmore household from a distance, noting who came and went, hoping to catch some thread of information that might loosen the knot tightening around Elira's neck. It was during one of these quiet evenings of observation that he first noticed Edwin Whitmore's strange behavior. The magistrate's nephew had always been known around town as a young man who enjoyed his leisure more than his responsibilities, spending coin freely on card games and horse races that his family's modest official income could not possibly cover. But in the weeks following Garrick Vane's death, Edwin had become a different person entirely. He rarely left the house except late at night, and when he did, he moved with the nervous energy of someone constantly checking over his shoulder. Cassian had followed him on one such night, staying far enough back to avoid detection, and watched as Edwin met briefly with a quiet man near the edge of the merchant district. The man, dressed plainly and carrying himself with the careful stillness of someone accustomed to unpleasant tasks, exchanged only a few words with Edwin before disappearing into a side alley. Cassian did not recognize him at the time, though he would later learn the man's name was Silas Crane, a servant in the Whitmore household, whose loyalty to the family ran deeper than most were aware. Cassian could not prove anything from that single encounter, but it was enough to convince him that something beyond a simple trial was happening beneath the surface of Ashford Hollow, and that Alira's arrest might have far less to do with justice and far more to do with protecting someone else entirely. When news reached him that morning that a duke had arrived unannounced and halted the execution at the very last moment, Cassian felt something close to disbelief. He had heard rumors the night before of unusual carriages spotted on the road leading into town, but he had not dared hope they carried anyone capable of changing Alira's fate. He left the garrison the moment he could slip away, making his way toward the town square, with his heart pounding harder than it ever had during any battle he had faced as a soldier. By the time he arrived, the crowd was already thinning, the spectacle of a postponed execution far less satisfying than the one they had come to witness. He pushed through the remaining onlookers until he reached the edge of the square, where he spotted Duke Roderick Ashvane standing near the platform, speaking quietly with one of his attendants. Cassian hesitated only a moment before approaching, knowing full well that a common soldier addressing a duke uninvited was a risk that could end his career, or worse. But he had already decided, somewhere in the long, sleepless nights since Alira's arrest, that her life mattered more to him than any position he might hold. "Your Grace," he said, bowing his head respectfully as he approached. "Forgive my forwardness, but I have information that may be relevant to the case you are investigating." Roderick turned toward him, with the calm, measured attention of a man who had learned long ago never to dismiss anyone, simply because of their rank. "And who are you to bring me such information?" "I am a soldier of the garrison, Your Grace. My name is Cassian Hale. I have been watching the Whitmore household in recent weeks, and I believe the magistrate's nephew may know more about Garrick Vane's death than he has admitted." The Duke's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened with interest. He gestured for Cassian to walk with him, away from the crowd's straining ears, toward a quieter corner of the square where their conversation would not be overheard. "Tell me everything you have seen," Roderick said, "and leave nothing out, no matter how small it may seem." Cassian recounted what he had witnessed, the late-night meetings, the nervous behavior, the exchange with the quiet man he now knew to be Silas Crane. He spoke carefully, aware that a single exaggeration or unsupported claim could undermine everything he was trying to accomplish. Roderick listened without interruption, his mind already weaving Cassian's account together with the inconsistencies he had noted in the trial documents during his journey to Ashford Hollow. "You understand," Roderick said, once Cassian had finished, "that what you are suggesting implicates the magistrate himself, either through direct involvement or through willful blindness toward his own family's actions." "I understand, Your Grace. But I also understand that an innocent woman was moments away from hanging for a crime I do not believe she committed." Roderick studied the young soldier carefully, noting the steadiness in his voice, despite the enormous risk he was taking by speaking so openly. "And what is your relationship to the accused, soldier? I suspect your interest in this matter extends beyond simple justice." Cassian hesitated only briefly before answering honestly. "She is someone I care for deeply, Your Grace. I will not pretend otherwise. But my feelings do not change the truth of what I have witnessed, nor do they invent evidence where none exists." The Duke allowed a small measure of respect to enter his expression, though his tone remained carefully neutral. "Very well. I will need more than your observations to move against a magistrate, particularly one who has held his position for many years and cultivated many friendships among the town's wealthier families. I will need the servant, Silas Crane, questioned directly, and I will need to understand exactly what debts Edwin Whitmore owed to the murdered merchant. I can help you find him, Your Grace. I know where he lodges." "Then you will accompany me," Roderick said, though quietly and without drawing attention to our purpose. "If the magistrate learns we are pursuing this line of investigation, before we have gathered sufficient proof, he will find a way to bury it beneath excuses and delays, or worse, ensure that the witnesses we need disappear entirely." As they made their way through the narrowing streets of Ashford Hollow toward the servant quarters near the Whitmore estate, neither man spoke of the danger they were walking into, though both understood it clearly. Somewhere within the walls of that grand house, a frightened young man and a loyal servant held the truth that could save Alira's life, and both Roderick and Cassian intended to pry that truth loose before the sun set on another day. Meanwhile, in the holding room where Alira waited, a guard arrived carrying a small tray of bread and water, more generous than anything she had been given during her imprisonment thus far. She accepted it with quiet gratitude, though she could not shake the feeling that something larger than her own fate was unfolding beyond the walls of her cell. Something that neither the magistrate nor his nephew would allow to surface without a fight. She thought again of Cassian, wondering if he even knew she was still alive, and hoped desperately that wherever he was, he had not given up on her the way the rest of the town so easily had. Silas Crane lodged in a narrow room above the stables at the edge of the Whitmore estate, a place chosen deliberately for its distance from the main house and the prying eyes of other servants. He had worked for the Whitmore family for nearly 15 years, starting as a stable hand and slowly earning the kind of trust that came only from years of silence and obedience. He asked no questions when given strange tasks in the middle of the night, and he expected no explanations in return. It was this quality, more than any other, that had made him the perfect person to carry out the request that now sat like a stone in his chest. When Roderick and Cassian arrived at the stables that afternoon, they found Silas mending a saddle strap with the careful, practiced movements of a man trying very hard not to think about anything else. He looked up when their shadows fell across the doorway, and something in his expression flickered, just briefly, before settling back into practiced calm. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" he asked, his voice steady despite the sudden tightness in his shoulders. "You can," Roderick said, stepping into the small room without waiting for an invitation. "You can tell me about the knife you placed beneath the floorboards of Alira Vance's cottage." The color drained from Silas's face so quickly that Cassian half expected the man to collapse where he stood. He opened his mouth as if to deny it, but no words came out, and the silence that followed was answer enough for both men watching him. "I do not know what you mean, Your Grace," he finally managed, though the tremor in his voice betrayed every word. "I think you know precisely what I mean," Roderick said, his tone calm but unyielding. "And I think you have spent the last 2 weeks hoping this exact conversation would never happen. I am not here to punish a servant who followed orders out of fear or loyalty. I am here to learn who gave those orders and why an innocent woman was nearly hanged to protect them." Silas's hands trembled as he set down the saddle strap, his eyes darting toward the doorway as if considering escape, though the presence of both a duke and an armed soldier made any such attempt hopeless. After a long moment, something in him seemed to break, the years of careful obedience finally giving way beneath the weight of what he had helped to do. "I did not want to do it," he said quietly. "Master Edwin came to me in a panic, saying his uncle needed my help with something urgent, something that would ruin the family if it were not handled quietly. I have served this family my whole life. I did not think to question him." "Tell me exactly what you did," Roderick said, "from the beginning, and leave nothing out." Silas took a shaking breath and began to speak, the words tumbling out of him now, like water through a broken dam. He described how Edwin had come to him 3 days after Garrick Vane's death, carrying a bloodied knife wrapped in cloth, instructing him to hide it somewhere in Alira Vance's cottage, where it would be found during a search. Silas had known the seamstress only in passing, had no personal reason to wish her harm, but he had done as instructed, prying loose a floorboard he had helped install years earlier, and placing the knife beneath it before hammering the board back into place. He had not asked why the knife needed to be hidden there specifically, though he suspected even then that it had something to do with covering up whatever truly happened between Edwin and the murdered merchant. He had told himself, in the days since, that his actions had simply preserved the family's reputation, that the seamstress would surely be found innocent, through some other means, if she truly had not committed the crime. It was a lie he had repeated to himself so many times that he had almost begun to believe it, until this very moment, standing before the Duke's unblinking gaze. "And the magistrate?" Roderick asked. "Was he aware of what his nephew asked of you?" Silas hesitated, clearly weighing the consequences of his answer. "I cannot say for certain what the magistrate knew directly, but I overheard Master Edwin telling him, the night after Garrick Vane's death, that he had been at the merchant's home that evening. The magistrate's response was not to seek the truth, but to ask how quickly the matter could be resolved before it damaged the family name." Cassian felt a surge of anger rise in his chest at the confirmation of what he had long suspected, though he kept his expression carefully neutral, aware that any outburst now might disrupt the delicate process of extracting the full truth from a frightened man. "Will you testify to what you have just told me?" Roderick asked, before the town's court, in front of witnesses, and in the presence of the magistrate himself. Silas's face went pale again, and for a moment it seemed he might refuse, the years of loyalty to the Whitmore family warring visibly against his conscience. But then he thought of the seamstress, who had nearly hanged for a crime she did not commit, a woman he had never wished harm upon, and something in him finally settled into resolve. "I will," he said quietly. "I have carried this weight long enough. I would rather face whatever punishment awaits me than let an innocent woman die in my place." Roderick nodded once, satisfied, though he understood that Silas's testimony alone would not be enough to fully unravel the conspiracy. He still needed to understand exactly why Edwin had visited Garrick Vane that night, what argument had turned deadly, and whether Edwin himself had struck the fatal blow, or whether some other party entirely had been involved. The pieces were coming together, but the full picture remained incomplete. "Where is Edwin Whitmore now?" he asked. "I believe he is at the house, Your Grace. He rarely leaves these days, except late at night, and always alone." Roderick turned to Cassian. "We will need to speak with him directly, though carefully. If he suspects we know the truth before we are ready to act, he may attempt to flee, or worse, convince his uncle to silence the witnesses we have already gathered." As they prepared to make their way toward the main house, Silas spoke again, his voice smaller now, almost pleading. "Your Grace, I must ask, what will happen to the seamstress? Has her execution truly been stopped?" "It has been postponed," Roderick answered, "though not yet cancelled. Your testimony, along with what we uncover from Edwin Whitmore, will determine whether she walks free, or whether this town commits an injustice it can never undo." The weight of those words settled heavily over all three men as they left the stables behind, each of them aware that the coming hours would determine far more than the fate of one accused woman. They would determine whether justice in Ashford Hollow could survive the influence of a family who had, for years, believed themselves above the consequences of their own actions. Back in the holding room, Alira remained unaware of the conversation unfolding across town, though something in the quality of the silence outside her window had shifted subtly throughout the afternoon, a tension she could not name, but felt pressing against her chest all the same. She paced the small room slowly, her thoughts circling endlessly between hope and fear, unable to settle on either one for more than a few moments at a time. She did not yet know that a servant's confession had just cracked open the foundation of the case against her, nor did she know that the man she loved was, at that very moment, walking toward the heart of the conspiracy that had nearly cost her life. All she knew was that the sky outside her window had begun to darken with the approach of evening, and that somewhere beyond these walls, her fate was being decided by people she had never met, and forces she could not control. The Whitmore estate stood at the edge of Ashford Hollow, a wide stone house surrounded by carefully tended gardens that spoke of wealth accumulated over generations rather than earned in a single lifetime. Roderick and Cassian approached through the servants' entrance at the rear of the property, avoiding the main gate, where the magistrate's household guards might recognize the Duke and send word ahead before they had a chance to speak with Edwin directly. They found him in the study, the same room where, weeks earlier, he had begged Garrick Vane for more time to repay his debts, only to watch the argument spiral into something neither of them had intended. Edwin sat hunched over a desk covered in unopened letters, his hair unwashed, his clothes rumpled in a way that suggested he had not changed them in several days. When the door opened without warning, he startled so violently that he knocked over a half-empty glass of wine, the dark liquid spreading across the desk, like a stain he could not stop from growing. "Who let you in here?" he demanded, though his voice cracked halfway through the sentence, robbing the words of any real authority. "Your uncle did not let us in," Roderick said, stepping into the room with the same unhurried confidence he had shown throughout the day. "We came through the servants' entrance. I believe you already know why." Edwin's eyes darted toward Cassian, recognition flickering briefly across his face before he tried to mask it with confusion. "I do not know who you are, soldier, or why you have brought a duke into my private study." "You know exactly who I am," Cassian said quietly. "I have watched you leave this house late at night for weeks now, meeting with a man who works for your family. I have watched your hands shake every time someone mentions Garrick Vane's name." Edwin's composure cracked further, his fingers curling into fists atop the wine-stained desk. "You have no proof of anything. This is nothing but the word of a common soldier against the nephew of the town's magistrate." "We have more than your word against mine," Roderick said calmly. "We have Silas Crane's full confession, given freely and without coercion, describing exactly how he hid the knife you gave him beneath the floorboards of Alira Vance's cottage." The color drained from Edwin's face so completely that for a moment Cassian feared the young man might faint outright. He opened his mouth several times as if to speak, but no denial came, only a shaking breath that betrayed the collapse of every wall he had built around himself in the weeks since the murder. "I did not mean for any of this to happen," he finally whispered, his voice small and broken, in a way that bore no resemblance to the arrogant young man Ashford Hollow had known before that fateful night. "I went to Garrick, only to beg for more time. He had already threatened to tell my uncle everything, the debts, the gambling, all of it. I could not let that happen. My uncle would have disowned me. He had made that clear enough times before." "And so you argued," Roderick said, his voice neither harsh nor forgiving, simply steady, drawing the truth forward one careful step at a time. "We argued," Edwin confirmed, tears beginning to gather at the corners of his eyes. "He mocked me. He said I was no better than a beggar dressed in fine clothes, that my family's name meant nothing if I could not pay what I owed. I do not even remember picking up the knife from his desk. I only remember him falling, and the blood, and the horror of realizing what I had done. And then you went to your uncle," Roderick continued, rather than confessing to the authorities. Edwin nodded, unable to meet the Duke's eyes any longer. "He told me he would handle it. He said the family name could not survive the scandal of my arrest, that I needed to trust him completely and say nothing to anyone. I did not know he intended to blame someone else for what I had done. I swear to you, I did not know until the seamstress was already arrested, and by then, it felt too late to undo what had been set in motion." Cassian felt his hands curl into fists at his sides, restraining the urge to demand why Edwin had said nothing, even after Alira's trial began, why he had allowed an innocent woman to stand before a rope meant for him, but he held his tongue, understanding that the confession unfolding before them mattered more in this moment than his own anger. "You allowed her to be tried," Roderick said, his voice hardening for the first time since they had entered the room. "You allowed her to be sentenced to death. You stood by, while your uncle built an entire case against a woman who had done nothing wrong, simply to protect yourself from the consequences of your own actions." "I was afraid," Edwin said, the tears finally spilling over now. "I am not proud of what I did, either that night or in the weeks since, but I was afraid of my uncle, afraid of losing everything, and I told myself that perhaps she would be found innocent through some other means, that I would not truly be responsible for her death." "That is precisely the kind of thinking that leads good men to terrible outcomes," Roderick said quietly. "You will accompany us now to the town hall, where you will repeat everything you have just told us in front of witnesses, and you will do so before your uncle has any opportunity to interfere with the process." Edwin's shoulders slumped in what looked almost like relief, the exhaustion of weeks spent carrying an unbearable secret finally overwhelming whatever fear remained of his uncle's wrath. "And what will happen to me?" he asked quietly, "once the truth is known?" "That will be for the court to decide," Roderick answered, "though I suspect a confession given freely and used to save an innocent life will weigh in your favor far more than continued silence ever could have." As they prepared to leave the study, a shadow fell across the doorway, and Magistrate Alden Whitmore stepped into the room, his face carefully composed despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. He had clearly been informed of their presence in the house, though whether by a servant's warning or simple instinct, none of them could say for certain. "What is happening here?" he demanded, his eyes moving quickly between his nephew's tear-streaked face and the Duke's unreadable expression. "Your nephew has just confessed to the murder of Garrick Vane," Roderick said plainly, watching closely for the magistrate's reaction, "and to your role in covering up his crime by arranging false evidence against an innocent woman." The magistrate's face went through several rapid transformations, shock giving way to calculation, calculation giving way to something that resembled desperate anger. "This is absurd. My nephew is clearly distressed, confused, perhaps even manipulated by these outside interests into confessing to something he did not do." "I did not lie, Uncle," Edwin said quietly, finding a strength in his voice that surprised even himself. "I have carried this too long. I will not let another person suffer for what I have done." The magistrate's composure finally shattered completely, his voice rising in a mixture of fury and panic, as he realized the carefully constructed story he had built over the past 2 weeks was collapsing before his eyes. "You foolish boy. Do you understand what you have just done? Do you understand what this will cost this family?" "I understand that it will cost less than an innocent woman's life," Edwin answered, and for the first time since the confession began, Cassian saw something like genuine courage flicker across the young man's face, however late it had arrived. Roderick stepped between uncle and nephew, his presence alone enough to still the escalating argument. "You will both accompany us to the town hall immediately, where a full accounting of these events will be made before witnesses. Any attempt to flee, or to interfere with this process, will only add further weight to the charges you already face." The magistrate's shoulders sagged, as the reality of his situation finally settled upon him. The careful web of favors and threats he had spun to protect his family, unraveling faster than he could possibly repair it. He said nothing further, as the small group made their way out of the estate and toward the town hall, where the truth that had been buried for 2 weeks would finally be spoken aloud for all of Ashford Hollow to hear. Word of the confession spread through Ashford Hollow faster than any rider could carry it, passed from servant to servant, from shopkeeper to customer, until the entire town seemed to hum with the news before the sun had fully set. But Magistrate Whitmore, even in the wreckage of his collapsing plan, was not a man who surrendered easily. As Roderick and Cassian escorted Edwin toward the town hall to prepare for a formal hearing, the magistrate excused himself briefly, claiming he needed to gather certain documents from his office, a request granted without suspicion given his position. What he did instead was make his way quickly and quietly toward the building where Elira was being held, slipping past the single guard on duty, with the ease of a man who controlled every appointment and posting in the town's small constabulary. He found her sitting near the narrow window, watching the darkening sky with an expression of cautious, fragile hope. "I need only a moment of your time," he said, closing the door behind him before she could react to his sudden presence. Elira rose slowly, uncertain whether to feel afraid or simply exhausted by the endless uncertainty of the past 2 weeks. "I have nothing to say to you that I have not already said in your own court, magistrate." "Then let me speak instead," he said, his voice low and urgent, stripped of the confident authority he usually wore like armor. "My nephew has made a confession that will destroy this family's name, and possibly his own life along with it. I cannot undo what has already been said. But I can still influence how this matter concludes, and I would advise you to consider carefully what you say when you are brought before the hearing tonight." "Are you threatening me?" Elira asked, though her voice trembled less than she expected it to. "I am offering you a choice," the magistrate said. "Say only what is necessary to secure your freedom. Do not speak of anything else you may have seen or suspected in the days surrounding the merchant's death. Do this, and I will ensure your family, whatever remains of it, and anyone close to you, faces no further difficulty in this town. Cross me further, and you may find that freedom comes with a heavier price than you expect." Elira's mind raced, understanding at once that the magistrate feared something beyond his nephew's confession, something she had not yet realized she possessed. She thought back carefully to the night in question, the evening she had delivered Garrick Vane's repaired coat to his home, arriving just as the last light of dusk faded from the sky. She had not told anyone, not even during her trial when speaking might have helped her case, about the figure she had glimpsed slipping out through the merchant's side gate as she approached the front entrance. She had been too far away to see a face clearly in the fading light, but she had noticed something distinct, a ring catching the last rays of sunset, an ornate silver band engraved with a pattern she recognized from seeing it displayed prominently on the magistrate's own hand during town gatherings, a family crest worn by only the closest members of the Whitmore household. At the time, she had dismissed the sighting as unimportant, assuming perhaps a servant had simply been leaving through a side door for entirely innocent reasons. It was only in the days following her arrest, as she pieced together the timeline of events, that she began to suspect what she had actually witnessed that evening. But fear had kept her silent. She had understood, even then, that accusing a member of the town's most powerful family, without solid proof, would only seal her fate more quickly, branding her not just a murderer, but a liar, desperate to escape justice by inventing wild accusations. Now, standing before the magistrate himself, watching the barely concealed panic beneath his composed exterior. She understood exactly what he feared she might reveal. "You are afraid I saw something that night," she said slowly, watching his expression carefully for confirmation. The magistrate's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but it was enough. "I am afraid of nothing, seamstress. I am simply advising you, for your own good, to consider the wisdom of silence." "I think," Elira said, straightening her shoulders despite the fear still coiling tightly in her chest, "that I have already been silent, far longer than I should have been. And I think that silence has cost me 2 weeks of my life, standing at the edge of a rope I did not deserve." The magistrate's composure finally cracked, his voice rising in barely restrained desperation. "You foolish woman, do you understand what you are risking? Do you understand that speaking further could bring danger, not just to yourself, but to anyone you care for?" "Is that a threat against Cassian?" she asked quietly, her heart pounding at the mere suggestion. The magistrate said nothing, which was answer enough. But before he could press his advantage further, the door to the room swung open, and Roderick himself stepped inside, his expression darkening as he took in the scene before him. "Magistrate Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying a cold authority that filled the small room entirely. "I believe you were meant to be gathering documents for tonight's hearing, not intimidating a witness whose testimony has already been delayed by your influence for 2 weeks." The magistrate's face drained of color as he realized he had been discovered. "Your Grace, I was simply ensuring the seamstress understood the gravity of speaking carelessly during a formal proceeding. Nothing more." "I believe," Roderick said, stepping fully into the room, "that I heard enough through that door to understand exactly what you were attempting. You will leave this room immediately, and you will be escorted directly to the town hall, where you will remain under guard until the hearing begins. Any further attempt to influence witnesses will be treated as an admission of your own guilt in this matter." The magistrate opened his mouth as if to protest, but the look on Roderick's face left no room for argument. He left the room without another word, his shoulders bent under the weight of a collapse he could no longer prevent. Once the door closed behind him, Roderick turned to Elira, his expression softening slightly, though his voice remained businesslike. "What did he say to you? And more importantly, what is it he fears you know?" Elira hesitated only a moment before answering, understanding now that the time for silence had truly passed. "I saw someone leaving Garrick Vane's home the evening he died. I did not see a face clearly, but I saw a ring, one I recognized from the magistrate's own hand, engraved with the Whitmore family crest. I did not know at the time what it meant. I only understood it after my arrest, and by then, I feared speaking would only make things worse for me." Roderick's expression sharpened with sudden understanding. That detail, paired with Edwin's confession and Silas Crane's testimony, will remove any doubt remaining about what truly happened that night, and about how deeply the magistrate involved himself in covering it up. "Will it be enough," Elira asked quietly, "to finally make them believe me?" "It will be enough," Roderick said, "for the truth to finally stand where lies have stood for far too long. But I will need you to speak these words yourself, before the full hearing, in front of every witness gathered there tonight. Can you do that?" Elira thought of the 2 weeks she had spent believing she would die for a crime she never committed, of the fear that had kept her silent when speaking might have mattered, and of the strength it would take now to stand before the very town that had so easily condemned her and finally tell them everything she knew. "I can," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I have been silent long enough." By the time night fully settled over Ashford Hollow, the town hall had filled with more people than it had seen in years. Word of the unfolding scandal drawing in shopkeepers, farmers, servants, and nobles alike, all eager to witness whatever truth was about to be revealed. Torches lined the walls, casting flickering shadows across rows of wooden benches packed shoulder to shoulder with curious townsfolk, their earlier hunger for an execution replaced entirely by hunger for a very different kind of spectacle. At the front of the hall, a long table had been arranged for the hearing, with Roderick seated at its center, flanked by 2 officials brought in from a neighboring district, specifically to ensure the proceedings could not be quietly influenced by local loyalties. Magistrate Whitmore sat to one side under guard, his face pale and drawn, while Edwin sat nearby, staring at his hands with the hollow expression of a man who had already accepted whatever punishment awaited him. Illyra was led into the hall last, and a hush fell over the crowd the moment she appeared, every eye following her as she walked slowly toward the front, her wrists finally unbound, though the weight of 2 weeks' imprisonment still showed clearly in the way she carried herself. She searched the crowd briefly, and found Cassian standing near the side of the hall, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that steadied her more than any words could have. Roderick called the hearing to order, his voice carrying easily through the packed room. "We are gathered tonight to examine the true circumstances surrounding the death of Garrick Vane, and to determine whether the conviction of Illyra Vance was based on truth or on deception, designed to protect those with greater influence in this town. I will hear testimony from each relevant party in turn, beginning with the servant known as Silas Crane." Silas rose from where he had been seated near the back of the hall, his legs visibly unsteady as he made his way to the front. He repeated, in careful detail, and before the full crowd, everything he had confessed earlier that day, describing how Edwin had brought him the knife, how he had hidden it beneath the floorboards of Illyra's cottage, and how he had acted out of loyalty and fear, rather than any personal malice toward the accused woman. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd as his words settled, disbelief and anger mixing in equal measure among the townsfolk who had so recently cheered for Illyra's execution. The magistrate sat rigid in his chair, his eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to meet the gazes now turning toward him from every direction. Next, Roderick called upon Edwin, who rose on unsteady legs, and repeated his confession, with the same broken honesty he had shown earlier that afternoon. He described the argument with Garrick Vane over his gambling debts, the moment of blind panic that led to the merchant's death, and his desperate decision to seek his uncle's help, rather than confess to the authorities immediately. "And did your uncle know," Roderick asked, his voice cutting cleanly through the murmuring crowd, "that an innocent woman was being blamed for your actions?" "He knew," Edwin said quietly, his voice barely audible even in the silent hall. "He chose to protect our family's name, rather than see justice served honestly." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and several townsfolk turned to stare openly at the magistrate, whose face had grown paler still, with every word spoken against him. He said nothing, offering no defense, understanding perhaps that any protest now would only deepen the crowd's growing fury. Finally, Roderick turned to Illyra. "You have something further to add to this hearing, I believe, something you have not spoken of until now." Illyra stepped forward, her heart pounding so loudly she feared the entire hall could hear it, though her voice, when it finally emerged, remained remarkably steady. "On the evening Garrick Vane died, I went to his home to deliver a coat I had repaired for him. As I approached, I saw a figure leaving through the side gate, moving quickly, clearly trying not to be seen. I did not see a face in the fading light, but I saw a ring on his hand, a silver band engraved with a crest I recognized from seeing it worn by the magistrate himself at town gatherings." The hall erupted into a wave of astonished whispers, and Illyra raised her voice slightly, to be heard over the growing noise. "I did not understand what I had seen until after my arrest, and by then I was too afraid to speak of it, fearing that accusing a member of the town's most powerful family would only make my situation worse. I was wrong to stay silent for as long as I did, but I am not wrong now. I saw that ring, and I believe it belonged to someone within the Whitmore household." Every eye in the room turned toward Edwin, whose hands, trembling visibly, bore no ring at all, having apparently removed it at some point in the weeks since the murder. But Roderick's sharp gaze had already moved past the nephew entirely, settling instead upon the magistrate, whose own hand, resting stiffly atop the table before him, bore an ornate silver ring bearing the exact crest Illyra had just described. "Magistrate Whitmore," Roderick said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of sudden and complete understanding, "will you explain to this hearing why you were seen leaving Garrick Vane's home on the very evening of his death, wearing the very ring you wear now?" The magistrate's composure finally shattered entirely, his face contorting through a rapid succession of emotions before settling into something like defeated resignation. "I went to speak with him myself, after learning of my nephew's debts from a servant's whispered warning. I went to negotiate on Edwin's behalf, to beg the merchant for leniency, before matters grew any worse. I left before anything happened between them. I swear upon my own name that I did not witness the killing itself. And yet you knew, immediately, exactly what had occurred. and exactly how to hide it, Roderick said. You did not report your own presence at the scene. You did not report your own presence at the scene. You did not report your own presence at the scene. You did not report your own presence at the scene. You did not report your own presence at the scene. You did not report your own presence at the scene. You did not report your own presence at the scene. You did not report your own presence at the scene. Whether or not your own hand delivered the fatal blow, your actions in the aftermath make you as guilty as anyone in this room of denying justice to the person nearly hanged for a crime that was never hers. The hall fell into stunned silence, broken only by the magistrate's ragged breathing as the full weight of his exposure settled over him. He said nothing further, understanding at last that no amount of influence or careful word choice could undo what had just been revealed before the entire town. Roderick rose slowly from his seat, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the packed hall. It is the judgment of this hearing that Alira Vance's conviction is hereby overturned, entirely, her innocence established beyond any reasonable doubt through the testimony gathered tonight. The matter of appropriate punishment for Magistrate Alden Whitmore and for his nephew Edwin Whitmore will be determined through proper process in the days that follow, conducted by officials without personal ties to this town or this family. A wave of sound rolled through the hall, some cheering, some weeping, some simply staring in stunned silence at how completely the story they had believed just hours earlier had been overturned. Elira stood at the center of it all, her legs finally giving way beneath the overwhelming release of 2 weeks' unbearable tension. Those strong arms caught her before she could fall, Cassian having crossed the hall the moment her name was cleared. "It is over," he whispered against her hair, his own voice thick with emotion. "You are safe. You are finally, truly safe." Behind them, guards moved to formally detain both the magistrate and his nephew, while the crowd continued to murmur and shift, processing the full magnitude of what had just unfolded within those torch-lit walls. Ashford Hollow, a town that had so nearly committed an unforgivable injustice, now faced the difficult task of rebuilding trust in a system that had so completely failed one of its own. The celebration in the streets outside the town hall did not last long before a new danger revealed itself, one that none of them had anticipated, in the exhausted relief following the hearing. As guards moved to escort Magistrate Whitmore toward a secure holding cell for the night, a commotion broke out near the rear entrance of the building, shouts rising sharply above the general murmur of the dispersing crowd. Cassian, still standing close beside Alira, turned instantly toward the sound, every instinct honed by his years as a soldier snapping into alertness. "Stay close to me," he said quietly, guiding her toward the wall away from the growing chaos. The commotion, it quickly became clear, had been caused by Captain Halric Doone, the head of the town's small constabulary, and a man who had served under Magistrate Whitmore's authority for over a decade. Loyal to a fault and deeply invested in protecting the reputation of the family that had appointed him to his position, Halric had gathered a handful of trusted men and attempted to intercept the magistrate's transfer, hoping to spirit him away from town before the outside officials could take custody of him for the journey to a proper trial. The attempt unraveled quickly, though not without a tense and dangerous few minutes. Halric and his men had positioned themselves near the rear door, timing their move for the moment. Guards led the magistrate out toward a waiting carriage. Swords were drawn, voices raised in confusion and alarm, as townsfolk scattered from the sudden violence threatening to erupt in their midst. Roderick, alerted by the noise, moved swiftly toward the disturbance, his own guards forming a protective line around him as he assessed the situation with the calm precision of a man who had faced far greater dangers than a handful of desperate loyalists. "Stand down," he called out, his voice carrying clear authority, even amid the chaos. "This man will face judgment through proper channels, not through the desperate schemes of those still hoping to protect him." Halric hesitated, clearly torn between his years of loyalty and the growing realization that his attempt had already failed the moment it began. He does not deserve to rot in some outside prison, judged by men who know nothing of this family's contributions to this town. He deserves exactly what any man deserves, who allowed an innocent woman to stand before a rope meant for someone else's crime. Roderick replied, his voice hardening. "Lower your weapons now, and this matter will end with your dismissal from your post rather than your imprisonment alongside him." The standoff stretched for several tense heartbeats, Cassian moving instinctively to shield Alira further behind him, his hand resting on the hilt of his own sword, though he prayed it would not be needed. Finally, one of Halrich's men lowered his blade, then another, until the captain himself, recognizing the hopelessness of his position, let his sword fall to the ground, with a sound that echoed sharply through the suddenly quiet street. "I only wish to protect the town from further scandal," Halrich said quietly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "The town has already suffered greater scandal from silence than it ever could from honest justice," Roderick answered. "Take him into custody as well. His actions tonight will be considered alongside whatever role he played in enabling the magistrate's earlier deceptions." As guards moved to secure Halrich and his remaining men, Alira felt Cassian's arm tighten protectively around her, his own relief palpable in the way his breathing slowly steadied after the sudden burst of danger. "I thought this night could not hold any more surprises," she said quietly, her voice still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the unexpected confrontation. "It seems Ashford Hollow has a great deal of unraveling left to do," Cassian answered, his tone gentler now that the immediate danger had passed. "But you are safe, that is all that matters tonight." The magistrate, watching the failure of his captain's desperate rescue attempt with an expression of hollow defeat, said nothing further, as he was finally loaded into the waiting carriage, under heavy guard, his journey toward formal judgment now unavoidable. Edwin, standing nearby under a lighter guard, given his cooperation, watched his uncle's departure, with an expression that mixed grief with something that looked almost like relief. The burden of 2 weeks' secrecy, finally, truly lifted from his shoulders. Roderick turned to address the remaining crowd, many of whom had gathered again despite the earlier scare, drawn by curiosity and the desire to witness the full resolution of a night that had already given them more drama than most towns saw in a decade. "The matter of Magistrate Whitmore's crimes, and those of his nephew, will be settled through formal proceedings conducted by officials from outside this town, ensuring fairness that could not be guaranteed through local authority alone. Alira Vance's innocence stands confirmed, and any further attempt to interfere with this outcome will be treated with the same severity shown tonight." The crowd's murmurs settled gradually into something resembling exhausted acceptance, the shock of the evening's revelations slowly giving way to the practical reality of a town that would need to rebuild its trust in the very institutions meant to protect it. As the last of the guards departed with their prisoners, the square outside the town hall grew quiet once more, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows across cobblestones that had so nearly run with an injustice no one could have undone. Alira remained close to Cassian as the crowd finally began to disperse fully, her mind still struggling to process the whirlwind of events that had unfolded since the moment the Duke's carriage first appeared at the edge of the execution grounds that very morning. It seemed impossible that so much could change within the span of a single day, that a life so close to ending could instead be given back so completely, though not without scars that would take far longer than a single night to heal. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, looking up at Cassian with an exhaustion that went deeper than mere physical tiredness. "Now," he said, brushing a strand of hair gently from her face, "we let you rest. Everything else can wait until morning." Morning arrived over Ashford Hollow with a stillness that felt entirely unfamiliar after the chaos of the previous night, the town's usual rhythms disrupted by the enormity of what had occurred within its borders. Alira woke in a small guest room within the town hall itself, arranged hastily by Roderick's attendants to ensure her safety and comfort, while the formal proceedings against the magistrate and his nephew were prepared. For the first time in 2 weeks, she had slept without the constant dread of an approaching execution pressing against her every thought, though the rest that came to her was fitful at best, her mind still turning over the events that had so completely upended her life. By mid-morning, word arrived that the outside officials, a pair of stern-faced magistrates from a neighboring province who owed no personal loyalty to the Whitmore family, had arrived to begin formal proceedings. The town hall filled once more, though with a far more subdued energy than the previous night's chaotic hearing, the crowd now approaching the matter with the sober understanding that real consequences were about to be decided for real people, regardless of the family names attached to them. Roderick presided over the opening of the proceedings, though he deferred the formal judgments to the visiting officials, understanding that any decision he handed down personally might later be questioned, as influenced by his own investigation into Garrick Vane's hidden trade dealings, rather than pure justice. The officials began with Edwin, whose confession the previous night, offered freely, and used to save an innocent life, weighed heavily in his favor, despite the gravity of his crime. You have confessed to a killing that occurred in a moment of panic, rather than premeditation, the elder of the two officials said, his voice measured and formal. And you have provided testimony that prevented the execution of an innocent woman, at considerable personal cost to yourself and your family's reputation. This court recognizes the difference between a crime born of fear and cowardice, and one born of calculated cruelty. You will face imprisonment, though the length of your sentence will reflect the mitigating circumstances of your cooperation. Edwin accepted the judgment without protest, his earlier arrogance entirely replaced by a quiet resignation that suggested genuine remorse rather than mere fear of punishment. As guards led him from the hall to begin his sentence, he paused briefly near where Alira sat and offered a small, awkward bow of apology, unable to find words adequate to the harm his silence had nearly caused her. The magistrate's judgment followed, and here, the officials showed considerably less leniency, understanding the deliberate and calculated nature of his actions, in constructing false evidence against an innocent woman, purely to protect his family's standing. You held a position of trust and authority within this town, the official said, his voice hardening noticeably as he addressed the former magistrate. You used that authority, not to seek justice, but to manufacture a false conviction, endangering an innocent life, to preserve your own reputation. This court strips you of your title and position permanently, and sentences you to imprisonment for a term reflecting the severity of your deception. Magistrate Whitmore, stripped now of the composed authority he had worn for years, accepted his sentence with none of the dignity he had once carried so effortlessly through the streets of Ashford Hollow. He was led from the hall in silence, the weight of his fall from grace evident in every slumped line of his posture. Silas Crane's case was considered separately, and here the officials showed measured compassion, acknowledging his voluntary confession and the coercive pressure of years of loyal service that had led him to follow orders without question. His sentence was considerably lighter, reflecting both his cooperation and the genuine remorse he had shown from the moment he first admitted his role in hiding the false evidence. Captain Halric Doone, whose failed rescue attempt the previous night had nearly resulted in further violence, received a sentence removing him permanently from any position of authority within the town, along with a period of confinement reflecting the seriousness of his attempt to obstruct justice through force. As the proceedings drew to a close, Roderick rose to address the crowd one final time, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would shape Ashford Hollow's future, far beyond the immediate resolution of this single case. This town will require a new magistrate, one selected through careful consideration, rather than inherited privilege. I will personally oversee the selection of a replacement, ensuring that the office is filled by someone committed to genuine justice, rather than the protection of powerful families. The crowd's response was subdued, but grateful, the exhausting drama of the previous day and night finally giving way to something resembling cautious hope for a more honest future. Elira, watching from where she sat beside Cassian, felt the last of the tension that had gripped her for 2 weeks finally begin to loosen, replaced slowly by an exhaustion that felt, for the first time, safe rather than fearful. After the hall emptied, Roderick approached her directly, his expression softer now than the calculated authority he had shown throughout the proceedings. You showed remarkable courage in speaking the truth you had carried in silence for so long. I understand the risk you took in doing so. I understand now that silence nearly cost me everything, Alira said quietly. I will not make that mistake again, no matter how frightening the truth may be to speak. A wise lesson, Roderick said, though one I hope you will never need to test again under such dire circumstances. I intend to see that this town treats you fairly, going forward, and that your name is fully restored in the eyes of everyone who so quickly condemned you. What will you do now that your freedom has been returned to you? Alira glanced toward Cassian, who stood nearby watching their conversation with quiet attentiveness, and felt, for the first time and longer than she could remember, the beginnings of a future she might actually look forward to building. I believe, she said slowly, that I would like to begin again, somewhere I am not remembered, only for the accusation that nearly ended my life. Then perhaps, Roderick said, we should discuss what that beginning might look like. 3 weeks passed before Alira felt truly ready to consider what her new beginning might look like. The time needed not just for the town's formal affairs to settle, but for her own heart and mind to recover from the ordeal she had survived. Ashford Hollow had begun the slow process of installing a new magistrate, a quiet and thoughtful man named Corwin Ashby, who had served for years in a neighboring district and carried none of the entangled loyalties that had corrupted the previous administration. The town, still reeling from the scandal that had gripped it so completely, seemed determined to rebuild its reputation through careful, deliberate honesty. Roderick had made good on his promise to help Alira begin again. He offered her a position within his own household at his estate, 3 days' journey from Ashford Hollow, working alongside the skilled seamstresses who maintained the wardrobes of his family and staff. It was, in many ways, a remarkable offer for a woman who had so recently stood accused of murder, but Roderick had made clear that her skill as a seamstress, evident in the fine work she had done for Garrick Vane before his death, deserved a place where her talents could flourish, free from the shadow of her recent past. Cassian, meanwhile, had requested and received a transfer to a garrison closer to the Duke's estate, unwilling to remain separated from Alira after everything they had endured together. His captain, having heard the full story of his role in uncovering the truth behind the false conviction, granted the request without hesitation, recognizing in Cassian a soldier whose loyalty and courage had proven far more valuable than simple obedience to convenient authority. On the morning of her departure from Ashford Hollow, Alira walked one final time through the streets that had so nearly witnessed her death, past the town square where the platform had since been dismantled, past the small cottage she had called home before her arrest, now emptied of her few remaining possessions and prepared for its next occupant. The townsfolk who passed her on the street offered quiet nods of acknowledgement, some apologetic, some simply respectful. The collective memory of the town's near injustice still fresh enough to color every interaction with careful humility. She found Cassian waiting for her at the edge of town, a small cart loaded with her belongings, hitched, and ready for the journey ahead. He offered his hand to help her onto the seat beside him, and she took it without hesitation, feeling none of the fear or uncertainty that had defined so much of her recent life. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly, studying her face for any sign of lingering doubt. "I have been ready for a new beginning since the moment I realized I might not survive to see one," she answered. "I do not intend to waste this chance now that it has been given to me." As they set off along the road, leading away from Ashford Hollow, Alira allowed herself to look back only once, watching the familiar rooftops shrink slowly into the distance behind them. She thought of Silas Crane, serving out his lighter sentence with what she hoped was genuine reflection on the harm his silent obedience had nearly caused. She thought of Edwin, imprisoned now for a crime born of panic and fear, carrying the weight of consequences he had tried desperately to avoid. She thought of the former magistrate, stripped of everything he had built his identity around, finally facing the justice he had so carefully denied to others. But mostly, she thought of the future stretching out ahead of her, uncertain in its details but no longer shadowed by the fear that had gripped her for so many terrible weeks. She had learned, in the harshest possible way, the cost of silence, and she carried that lesson forward with her now, determined never again to let fear keep her from speaking truth when it mattered most. The journey to the Duke's estate passed in a blend of quiet conversation and comfortable silence, Cassian sharing stories of his years as a soldier, Alira describing the small joys she remembered from her years as a seamstress before tragedy had upended her life so completely. By the time they arrived at the grand estate that would become her new home, the sun had begun its slow descent toward evening, casting the stone walls and manicured gardens in warm, golden light. Roderick himself came to greet them upon their arrival, his usual reserved formality softened by something that looked almost like genuine warmth. "Welcome to your new home," he said, gesturing toward the estate behind him. "I trust the journey was comfortable." "More comfortable than I had any right to expect, given how this story began," Alira answered, a small smile finally reaching her lips, the first genuine expression of happiness she had allowed herself in longer than she could remember. "Then perhaps," Roderick said, "this marks the true ending of that particular chapter, and the beginning of something considerably brighter." As evening settled fully over the estate, Alira stood beside Cassian in the gardens, watching the last light of day fade slowly into stars scattered across a clear sky, and allowed herself, finally and completely, to believe that the worst of her ordeal truly truly lay behind her. A full year passed before Alira found herself once again standing before a gathered crowd, though this time the circumstances could not have differed more completely from the terrifying morning that had once nearly ended her life. The estate's grand hall had been decorated with simple but elegant care. Garlands of late-season flowers draped along the windows, long tables arranged for a celebration rather than a trial. She stood at the front of the hall in a gown of her own careful design, the fine stitching a testament to the skill that had only grown sharper during her year, working alongside the estate's most talented seamstresses. Cassian stood beside her, dressed in a formal uniform that marked his recent promotion within the Duke's own personal guard, a position earned through the same steady courage and quiet integrity that had first drawn him to investigate the injustice unfolding in Ashford Hollow. Their wedding, modest by the standards of the estate's usual grand occasions, but rich with genuine warmth, drew guests from both their old lives and the new one they had built together over the past year. Roderick attended himself, offering a rare public toast to the couple whose story had, in its own quiet way, reshaped his understanding of justice and the dangers of accepting convenient explanations without deeper scrutiny. "A year ago," he said, raising his glass before the assembled guests, "I traveled to a small town intending only to investigate matters of trade and taxation. I found instead a woman whose courage in speaking truth, even after it had nearly cost her everything, reminded me of what true justice actually requires. I am honored to call both of you friends, and I wish you every happiness in the life you have built together." News had reached them periodically over the past year, regarding the fates of those left behind in Ashford Hollow. Edwin Whitmore, still serving his sentence, had reportedly become known among the prison staff for his quiet diligence and genuine remorse, several officials noting that his cooperation in preventing further injustice had earned him a measure of respect he had never possessed during his years of careless privilege. The former magistrate, stripped of his title and standing, had grown increasingly isolated during his imprisonment, visited by none of the powerful friends who had once courted his favor so eagerly. Silas Crane, having served his lighter sentence, had returned quietly to Ashford Hollow, taking work as a simple laborer far removed from the influential household he had once served so unquestioningly. Word reached Alira occasionally that he had become known for a newfound willingness to speak plainly and honestly, as if the weight of his earlier silence had taught him a lesson he intended never to forget. Ashford Hollow itself had slowly begun to heal under the guidance of its new magistrate, Corwin Ashby, proving himself throughout the year to be exactly the kind of careful, honest administrator the town had desperately needed. The near execution of an innocent woman remained a story told cautiously among the townsfolk, a reminder of how quickly convenient explanations could curdle into terrible injustice when left unquestioned by those with the power to demand better. As the wedding celebration continued late into the evening, Alira found a quiet moment to step outside, onto the estate's terrace, looking out over the same gardens where she had first allowed herself to believe her ordeal had truly ended. Cassian joined her a few minutes later, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders as they both gazed out at the stars scattered across the clear night sky. "Do you ever think about that morning?" he asked quietly, standing on that platform, waiting for the rope. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I think of it differently now than I once did. I do not dwell on the fear I felt, though it was very real. I think instead of the courage it eventually gave me, the understanding that silence, however safe it may feel in the moment, often costs far more than the risk of speaking truth honestly." "A hard lesson to learn," Cassian said softly. "The hardest," Alira agreed, "but one I would not trade for anything, given everything it eventually brought me." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the sounds of celebration drifting quietly from the hall behind them, the weight of everything they had survived together finally settling into something resembling peaceful acceptance rather than lingering trauma. Alira thought of the Duke, who had arrived so unexpectedly on the morning of her intended execution, driven initially by concerns of trade and taxation rather than simple justice, and yet who had ultimately become the instrument through which her innocence was finally proven and her life fully restored. She thought of the courage it had taken to speak the truth she had carried silently for so long, the small detail of a ring glimpsed in fading evening light that had, in the end, unraveled an entire conspiracy built on fear and false convenience. And she thought, Finally, of the future stretching out ahead of her now, bright and uncertain and entirely her own, no longer shadowed by the terrible morning that had once nearly stolen it away completely. The stars above the estate shone clear and steady, indifferent to the small human dramas that had unfolded so dramatically over the past year. And yet Alira found comfort in their quiet permanence, a reminder that even the darkest nights eventually gave way to dawn, and that even the most carefully constructed lies eventually crumbled before the simple, unyielding power of truth finally spoken aloud.